Good day, grade 11s. I am your tutor for today, Ms. Nokuthula Zulu, and we'll be looking at business studies, challenges of the business environments. Did you know factors from 3 business environments can influence a business both internally and externally? Some of these factors can be controlled and others cannot, so they present challenges to businesses. So one thing that you need to know, learners, is that the business environments, they have components within them, whereby these components, they pose challenges to businesses. And as businesses, for us to be successful, we need to make sure that we eliminate some of these challenges that are posed by the business environments, or else we adapt to some of them. Now, let's look at the business lesson objectives. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain the challenges of the micro, market, and macro environments. You should also be able to give examples of contemporary legislation that may affect business operations. And lastly, you should be able to recommend ways in which businesses can overcome competition. Now, let's look at our concept map. With the concept map, it's just an overview of the lesson for today, what we are going to cover in this lesson. We'll start with the challenges of the micro environment, then we move on to the challenges of the market environment, then we move on to the challenges of macro environment, and lastly, we are going to look at ways in which businesses can overcome competition. Now, let's look at the pre-knowledge. Before we start this lesson, this is the knowledge that you should be knowing by now. You must know the influences of the business environments, and you must know how to identify the business environments from case studies, scenarios, and statements. Now, let's look at the pre-knowledge practice to test if whether you know what you should be knowing before we start the lesson. Now, let's read the scenario below and answer the questions that follows. Eric's Supermarket, ES. Eric's Supermarket employed a manager that lacks management skills. The increase in the minimum wages of employees that is enforced by legislation is making it hard to make a profit. Recently, a new 24-hour supermarket opened across the street of Eric's Supermarket. Now let's move on to the pre-knowledge practice question number 1. Identify 3 business environments from the scenario. Motivate your answer by quoting from the scenario. Now let's go back to our scenario. Eric's Supermarket employed a manager that lacks management skills. So where do we find the manager? We find the manager inside the business. So that has to be our business, our micro environment. So Eric's Supermarket employed a manager that lacks management skills. It's our micro environment. Then we move on. The increase in the minimum wages of employees that is enforced by legislation is making it hard to make a profit. So this legislation tells us a lot. We don't make legislation inside the business, but it's something that is being done by government. So where do we find our government? We find our government in the macro environment. So this statement is a motivation of our macro environment. Now, here's the answer for our second business environment, which is the macro. Now we look at the last statement, which says, recently a new supermarket opened across the street of Eric's Supermarket. Now, this new supermarket is a threat to the business. And where do we find competitors? We find competitors under the market environment. There we go. Now, let's move on to the second pre-knowledge practice question. State the extent of control ES has over each business environment identified in question 1. The first business environment that we have identified was the micro environment. And since it's the internal part of the business has full control because everything that happens within the business, we are able to control it. Then the second business environment will be the market environment, whereby the business has less or limited or partial control. Reason being, it's not inside the business, but it's immediate outside the business. So as the business, we are able to influence some of the components in this environment. So that's the reason we say market has less or limited or partial control. Then we move on to the last business environment, which is our macro environment. In that environment, we have no control as a business. Then, let us move on to the new words and language. Remember, the new words and language, these are the words that you'll come across throughout the lesson. So it's very important that you understand each and every word so that it will be easier for you to grasp the concept that I'll be teaching you today. Now, let's start with the first word, strikes. Situations where workers refuse to work until employers meet their demands. Then we have go-slows, situations where employees go to work as they normally would, but deliberately work at a slower pace to demonstrate dissatisfaction. Socio-cultural factors, the beliefs, norms, values, and interests that are shared by a particular society. Let's move on to other new words. Psychographics, consumers' attitudes, interests, opinions, and lifestyles. Contemporary legislation, current laws put in place by the government to regulate the operations of businesses in the country. High employee turnover, when the rate at which employees join and leave the business is high. Then we move on to labor restrictions, labor laws put in place by the government to prevent the exploitation of employees in the workplace. Then we have globalization, when businesses expand their operations to other countries. Now, let's just go for a quick ad break and we will be back. Stay tuned.